58 days. That was how long hundreds of exhausted volunteers surrounded a city they could not capture. Food was running out. Morale was collapsing. Some wanted to abandon the siege entirely. Others believed the revolution itself was already dying in the mud outside its walls. Then one aging frontiersman, wrapped in a worn buckskin coat, stepped in front of the camp and asked a single question.
Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio?
Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio? Roughly 300 men stepped forward. Within 5 days, the city would fall. Within months, Texas would never be the same. And within a few short weeks after that, this very victory would set the stage for one of the deadliest disasters in American history. But to understand why 300 exhausted, half-starved volunteers were willing to walk into a fortified city full of Mexican soldiers and cannon fire, we need to go back further. Back to why Texas was ever on the edge of war in the first place. In the early 1830s, Texas was not yet its own nation. It was a distant, sparsely populated province of Mexico tied to a government hundreds of miles away in Mexico City. American settlers had poured in over the previous decade, lured by cheap land and the promise of opportunity. They built farms, towns, and lives under Mexican law, and for a while, an uneasy peace held. That peace was built on one document, the Constitution of 1824. It gave Texas a degree of self-governance, protected certain rights, and let settlers believe their futures were secure. Then came Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. What began as a promising political reformer soon revealed something else entirely. Santa Anna dismantled the Federalist Constitution, centralized power in his own hands, and stripped states like Texas of the autonomy they had been promised. For settlers who had built their lives on those promises, this felt like betrayal. Anger spread through Texas like wildfire. Meetings turned into militias. Militias turned into armed resistance. By the fall of 1835, war was no longer a possibility. It was happening. And at the center of that war sat one city that both sides desperately needed to control: San Antonio de Béxar. It wasn't just a town, it was the beating heart of Spanish and Mexican Texas. The oldest and most established settlement in the region, home to the crumbling but strategically vital Alamo mission, and the political capital of Mexican Texas. Whoever held Bexar held the roads. Whoever held the roads controlled supply lines stretching from the Texas interior down toward the Rio Grande and Mexico beyond. Losing the city would mean losing the entire province. Keeping it would mean the rebellion had a fighting chance to survive its first real test. Both sides knew this, and both sides were about to collide over it. Leading the Texian forces was a coalition of men as different from each other as their reasons for fighting. Stephen F. Austin, the reluctant founder of Texas colonization, found himself thrust into a military role he never wanted, more diplomat than soldier. Edward Burleson, steady and experienced, would eventually take command of the volunteer army. Frank Johnson brought aggressive energy to the ranks. And then there was Ben Milam, a man in his 50s, a veteran of Mexican imprisonment, restless, respected, and utterly done with waiting. On the other side of the wall stood General Martín Perfecto, brother-in-law to Santa Anna himself, tasked with holding Bexar at any cost. Caz was no fool. He fortified the town, reinforced the Alamo compound, placed artillery at key intersections, and settled in for a long defense. He believed the Texians lacked the discipline, the artillery, and the patience for a real siege. He was about to be proven partly right, and partly catastrophically wrong. On October 12, 1835, Texian forces began surrounding San Antonio de Béxar. At first, there was energy, excitement. The rebels believed this would be quick, a matter of days before Caz surrendered or was overwhelmed. They were wrong. Skirmishes broke out along the outskirts of town. Snipers took potshots from rooftops and tree lines. Artillery from both sides thundered across open fields, more noise than damage. Neither side had the firepower to force a decisive breakthrough, and neither side was willing to back down. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing week, the fire that had brought hundreds of volunteers to this siege began to dim. Supplies dwindled. Winter cold crept into camp at night. Food that had once been plentiful became scarce, rationed, then desperately scarce. Disease spread through crowded, unsanitary camps the way it always does when men are packed together with nowhere to bathe and nothing but boredom to occupy their minds. Arguments broke out among the officers. Some wanted to press the attack immediately, storm the walls, and force the issue. Others believed the volunteer army wasn't ready. Undisciplined militia against fortified positions was a recipe for slaughter. Austin, exhausted from months of political and military strain, eventually left to pursue a diplomatic mission in the United States, handing command over to Burleson. Morale cracked. Entire companies began packing up and heading home, convinced the siege was a lost cause. By late November, the Texian army that had once numbered in the many hundreds had shrunk considerably. Whispers spread through camp that maybe this was it, maybe the revolution would die here. Not in a blaze of glory, but in quiet, exhausted retreat. The audience watching this unfold, if they had been there, would have felt something dangerous creeping through the ranks. Not fear of the enemy. Fear that this was over before it had truly begun. And then, on the night of December 4th, everything changed. Ben Milam had spent weeks growing more frustrated with the standstill. He was not a young man. He had already survived imprisonment at the hands of Mexican authorities earlier in his life, had already given years to the cause of Texas independence, and was not willing to watch that cause dissolve into another failed camp of quarreling volunteers. So he made a decision that would define the entire campaign. He walked out in front of the remaining men, roughly the number who hadn't already given up and gone home, and asked the question that would become legend. Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio? It wasn't a command. It was an invitation, a challenge, a test of whether these men had come to Texas to talk about revolution or to fight for one. Roughly 300 men stepped forward. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense of two armies meeting on an open field. It was something far more brutal, far more intimate, and far more terrifying. At dawn on December 5th, Texian forces pushed into the streets of San Antonio de Béxar. This was urban warfare, house to house, room to room, wall to wall, decades before the term would become common in military vocabulary. There were no open charges across grassy fields. There was only smoke-filled streets, collapsing adobe walls, and the constant disorienting crack of gunfire echoing between buildings. Texian volunteers used crowbars and axes to smash through the walls of homes, moving from one building to the next, without ever stepping into open exposed streets where Mexican defenders could cut them down. Mexican soldiers, meanwhile, had fortified rooftops and barricaded key intersections, raining musket fire and cannon shot down onto anyone caught in the open. Dust and gun smoke hung thick in the cold December air. Men shouted orders that were barely heard over the constant thunder of gunfire. Barricades made of furniture, rubble, and anything that could stop a musket ball blocked narrow streets. Snipers picked off targets from church towers and rooftops. Every corner turned might reveal an enemy soldier, or an empty room offering a moment's safety before the fighting resumed. For 5 days, this brutal, grinding, street-by-street struggle continued. Progress was measured not in miles but in buildings, a captured house here, a cleared block there, each step forward paid for in blood. And on the third day of fighting, tragedy struck the Texian ranks directly. Ben Milam, the very man whose challenge had ignited this assault, was killed by a sniper's bullet while directing his men through the chaos of the urban battlefield. He never saw the city fall. He never saw the victory his courage had made possible, but his death did not stop the assault. If anything, it hardened the resolve of the men fighting in his name. The momentum he had built carried forward, building by building, street by street, until Mexican defenses began to buckle under the relentless pressure. By December 9th, General Cas understood what his soldiers already knew. This position was no longer defensible. Negotiations began. Cas, recognizing that continued resistance meant only continued slaughter for his men, agreed to surrender terms. Mexican forces would withdraw from Texas entirely, marching south across the Rio Grande, leaving behind their artillery, their supplies in the city they had fought so hard to hold. For the Texian rebels, this was an extraordinary, almost improbable victory. A volunteer force with no formal training, minimal artillery, and crumbling morale had taken a fortified city defended by a professional garrison through sheer determination and brutal urban combat. But victory, as it so often does in war, came at a steep price. The city itself was scarred almost beyond recognition. Walls had been smashed open, buildings burned or collapsed. Streets that had once held families and markets were now littered with the debris of 5 days of house-to-house fighting. Casualties on both sides were significant, though the Texians had lost dramatically fewer men than the entrenched Mexican garrison, a testament to the effectiveness of their unconventional tactics. Captured Mexican artillery and supplies gave the Texian cause desperately needed resources, and for the first time since the rebellion began, it seemed as though Texas might actually win its independence. There was celebration. There was relief. There was a sense finally that the hardest part was over. That belief would prove dangerously, tragically wrong. In the weeks following the victory at Bexar, something happened that would echo through Texas history with devastating consequences. Convinced that the war was effectively won, and exhausted from months of grinding siege warfare, Many Texian volunteers simply went home. Enlistments expired. Men who had left families and farms behind decided they had done their part. The army that had captured San Antonio de Béxar began shrinking dramatically, just as the greatest danger of the entire revolution was quietly gathering strength south of the border. Santa Anna had not forgotten Bexar. He had not forgiven it. And he was already assembling a massive force to march north, determined to crush the rebellion and reclaim the city that had humiliated his brother-in-law and his army. The garrison left behind to hold San Antonio de Béxar and the aging mission compound known as the Alamo would be a fraction of the force that had originally taken the city. They believed they had time. They believed the war was largely won. They had no idea what was coming. The Siege of Béxar rarely gets the recognition it deserves in the story of Texas independence. It lives in the shadow of what followed just weeks later at the very same location, the desperate last stand at the Alamo, and the shocking massacre that shocked the world and became the rallying cry for Texian independence at San Jacinto. But without Béxar, there is no Alamo story to tell. Without the exhausted volunteers who followed Ben Milam through smoke-filled streets, without the sacrifice that captured this vital city, the small garrison that would make its legendary stand weeks later would never have been there at all. Béxar was not just a battle. It was the hinge on which the entire Texas Revolution turned, a victory so complete that it created the very conditions for the tragedy that followed. The confidence it inspired emptied the ranks. The city it delivered became the trap that swallowed those who remained. 300 men answered a question asked by a tired, aging frontiersman on a cold December night. Most of them survived. Their commander did not. And the city they bled for would, within weeks, become the most famous battlefield in American history for reasons none of them could have imagined. Without the Siege of Béxar, there is no Alamo. And without the Alamo, perhaps, there is no Texas as we know it today.